In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of circulatory systems found in different animals. So first, let's take a look at the difference between an open and a closed circulatory system. So let's start by looking at the open circulatory system, which we can see in this picture of a bee right here. So in an open circulatory system, blood is mixed with interstitial fluid, and interstitial fluid is also just known as tissue fluid. Or extracellular fluid. And so the blood gets mixed with this other fluid and it forms this kind of new fluid called hemolymph. And that hemolymph just kind of fills the cavities inside the body. And the cavity inside the body is called the hemocoel. And so that's where that hemolymph is going to be found. And there is a heart, or potentially more than one heart, that is moving this hemolymph throughout the hemocoel. So you can see on this picture of the bee, there are multiple hearts here. And then the hemocoel is going to be this body cavity here. And that's where the hemolymph will be. And so there is a kind of a partial blood vessel here, but ultimately that hemolymph ends up just kind of filling this body cavity here, where it then ultimately does go back into this blood vessel. So the hemolymph circulates throughout the body, and it does return to the heart through these ostia, so these special holes or openings that allow the hemolymph to go back into the blood vessel. So the hearts can then beat or contract in order to kind of push it around. An open circulatory system is found in most arthropods. So remember, arthropods include things like insects and arachnids. Many mollusks also have an open circulatory system, but not all of them. For example, the cephalopods, which include squid and cuttlefish and octopus and nautilus, they actually have a closed circulatory system. One benefit of an open circulatory system is that it uses less energy, but there is also a downside. It also is less efficient. You are probably more familiar with a closed circulatory system because that's what we have as humans. And in a closed circulatory system, blood is contained within vessels and potentially a heart. So you can see this picture of an earthworm here, or this is kind of a cross-section of an earthworm. And you can see that there are blood vessels kind of running through the earthworm, the different segments of the earthworm. And there are hearts in each section as well. So in an earthworm, there are multiple hearts that are kind of creating the pressure to move the blood around the blood vessels. Now in humans, we just have one heart that does the work to move all the blood around our body. In a closed circulatory system, the blood circulates in one direction from and then back to the heart. All vertebrates have a closed circulatory system, and some invertebrates have a closed circulatory system. So things like crustaceans, which includes things like lobsters and crabs, and cephalopods, which includes squid and octopi, are all invertebrates that have a closed circulatory system. And then all vertebrates, so that includes things like mammals, fish, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And one benefit to having a closed circulatory system is that the circulation is more efficient. And the blood can also be directed typically towards tissues and cells that are more metabolically active. So remember that one of the kind of functions of blood is to transport nutrients and oxygen to different cells. And the cells need that to do cellular respiration. So metabolically active just means that it is a tissue that is being used and it needs to be able to do cellular respiration. And to do cellular respiration, it needs oxygen and nutrients like glucose. So in a closed circulatory system, some of the blood vessels can constrict while others can dilate, and that can actually help to direct blood to the tissues that need it and away from the tissues that don't need it at that moment. So let's take a look at some different variations in the circulatory system. And we're going to start by actually talking about some organisms that don't have an open or closed circulatory system because they don't have a circulatory system at all. So the phyla Porifera and Rotifera. So remember, Porifera were our sponges and Rotifera were rotifers. And these are organisms that do not have a circulatory system. They just have simple diffusion, which exchanges nutrients and respiratory gases with the environment. In the phyla Cnidaria and Ctenophora, so these are going to be the jellies, including the comb jellies. They have something called a gastrovascular cavity. And so they essentially have this area where substances can kind of go into the body and it can be circulated around this cavity where diffusion happens between the cavity and the tissues. And then ultimately any waste products are going to be delivered back out through that opening. So similar to Porifera and Rotifera, simple diffusion is what is going to carry things like oxygen into the cells and tissues and carbon dioxide out of the cells and tissues. But there isn't really a true circulatory system. It's just kind of an area where fluids are mixing and moving around. Now we're going to take a closer look at the vertebrates. And so remember that all vertebrates have a closed circulatory system, but there are some differences between fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. And so we're going to take a look at each different type on the following slides. So let's start by looking at the circulatory system of a fish. And so fish are known to have one circuit. So essentially blood comes into the heart in one direction and leaves the heart in one direction. They have a two-chambered heart. So they have one atrium and one ventricle. So the atrium is receiving the blood from other areas, and the ventricle is sending the blood back out to other tissues. So the flow of blood happens where the blood comes into the atrium and then out through the ventricle. It then goes to the gills, which have a significant number of capillaries. These are kind of similar to pulmonary capillaries. And in the gills, you have carbon dioxide that's going to leave the blood and go into the water, and then dissolved oxygen is going to diffuse from the water into the blood. And on this diagram here, it's pretty common that you'll see that blue is a color used to represent deoxygenated blood. Meaning that it has a lot of carbon dioxide and less oxygen. And red is used to represent oxygenated blood. Which has lower carbon dioxide and higher oxygen. And then purple is used sometimes to represent mixed blood. And by mixed blood, I mean mixed oxygenated plus deoxygenated. So you can see in this diagram here that the heart is essentially sending out deoxygenated blood to the gills, where it picks up oxygen and drops off carbon dioxide. And then that oxygenated blood is going to move through the blood vessels to the systemic capillaries. And so these are the body capillaries, or we could call them the systemic capillaries. And at the systemic capillaries, the capillaries are going to drop off oxygen, which are going to go to the cells and tissue so that they can do cellular respiration. And it's going to pick up carbon dioxide, which was produced by those cells and tissues when it already performed when it already performed cellular respiration. And then that carbon dioxide, or that deoxygenated blood, is going to leave the systemic circulation and head back to the heart, where it's going to return to the atrium and then go into the ventricle, where it then leaves to go back out to the gills. Now, because there is some mixing of the blood, there's actually a gradient of oxygen in the blood. And so this actually limits the amount of oxygen that can reach some of the tissues. And due to this, it does limit the metabolic rate of fish. In amphibians, there are two circuits, although they do kind of end up mixing together in the heart. But there is a kind of like a pulmonary circuit, but it's actually called the pulmocutaneous circuit. Pulmo refers to lungs. Cutaneous refers to the skin. So remember that amphibians, most of them have lungs, but they can also do gas exchange across their skin. And then the second circuit is the systemic circuit, which is going to be all the other tissues and cells in the body. Now, amphibians have a three-chambered heart. They have two atria, so they have a right atrium and a left atrium, which we can see here and here. But they only have one ventricle. So you can see that the blood from the atria mixes together in the ventricle. And you'll notice that the color that is represented here is purple. And that purple is representing the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood that ends up kind of mixing in the heart. And this does make the circulatory system a bit less efficient than if the blood were to not mix, which is what we would see in mammals. So if we look at the flow of blood through an amphibian's circulatory system, so first of all, the systemic circulation returns to the right atrium, which is the same as humans. And so we've got blood coming into the right atrium. Whereas the oxygenated blood coming from the pulmocutaneous circuit returns to the left atrium, which once again is kind of similar to mammals, where the right atrium gets deoxygenated blood from the body tissues, and the left atrium gets oxygenated blood from the lungs. Now, because of that one ventricle, the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood does kind of mix, but there is a little bit of a separation due to something called a ventricular ridge. And so you'll see that the blood leaving the heart, there is kind of a deoxygenated blood going back out to the pulmocutaneous circuit, and the oxygenated blood is going to the systemic capillaries, or the systemic circulation, where once again it is going to drop off oxygen for the tissues in order to allow the tissues to do cellular respiration and pick up carbon dioxide. And then going back to the pulmocutaneous circulation, remember that it is going to be dropping off carbon dioxide so that it can get removed from the body, and it's going to take up oxygen. Reptiles are similar to amphibians in that they have two circuits, but they do not do gas exchange across their skin. So it is a true pulmonary circuit and not a pulmocutaneous circuit like you saw in amphibians. And so it just has a circuit that goes to the lungs and another circuit that goes to the other body tissues. Like amphibians, they do have a two-chambered heart. They have a right atrium and a left atrium. And blood enters the right atrium from the systemic circulation. And so this is going to be deoxygenated blood, so blood that has a lot of carbon dioxide and less oxygen. And then they technically have one ventricle, but you can see on the picture here that it kind of shows a right ventricle and a left ventricle. And so even though those ventricles, you can see kind of in the middle here, they do mix, but they have this structure called a septum. And the septum, let me erase this right here. And the septum right here helps to keep the deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood somewhat separated. So they do still mix, but because of the septum, the blood doesn't mix as much as it could. So it makes it a little bit more efficient with regards to keeping the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separated. So as you can see, the right side of the heart is going to then send out the deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary circulation, so to the lungs, where it's going to drop off carbon dioxide so it can be exhaled and take up oxygen. And then that oxygenated blood is returning to the left side of the heart, where it is then going to get pumped out to the systemic circulation, where it is going to be dropping off oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide. And then that deoxygenated blood goes back to the right side of the heart. In birds and mammals, they have two circuits. So they have a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. And they have a true four-chambered heart. And so there is a right atrium, a left atrium, a right ventricle, and a left ventricle. And the blood in the two don't mix, so they are totally separated from each other, which makes it more efficient and essentially lets birds and mammals have a higher metabolic rate. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of circulation here, or the path of circulation, because it's covered in other videos. The majority of what we've talked about in this lesson has to do with mammals.